last year there was mania in the first day of free agency. This year, I would say there was restrained enthusiasm. And by that, I mean, although a few guys got good contracts, big contracts, I'd say in general, last year, people kind of, led by New England, went crazy in free agency early on. And I think there's two things that I think happened this year. Even though there are some good players here, I think the cornerback position is a great example of what happened, okay? And that is that one guy made what I would call really big money, and that's J.C. Jackson, who signed with the Chargers for 5 years, $82 million. But if you look at the contract closely, all the guaranteed money is in the first 2 years. So essentially, while their quarterback, Justin Herbert, is only on the hook for $7.2 million in cap charges this year. So essentially, it's really kind of funny to see how teams handle this part of free agency, because when your quarterback only counts for about 4% of your salary cap, this is a year that you can do a lot. And so the Chargers said, okay, we're going to do a lot. We won't be able to do as much next year because we're going to be having to worry about a long-term contract for Justin Herbert. This is the year to strike while the iron's hot. But the contract is smart because all the guaranteed money is out of there in the first 2 years. So I think, and the fact that this contract is very similar to the leading contract in the market in 2020, Byron Jones going from Dallas to Miami for a similar contract, not exactly the same, a little bit less, honestly, J.C. Jackson's contract. I think that tells me, and then all these other cornerbacks, if you look at Carlton Davis, in a lot of places, Paul, the second best corner on the market, he got $15 million a year from the Bucs. And then you look at all the corners who are still available, led by Stephon Gilmore, who's healthy, had a good year when he played last year for the Carolina Panthers. And I think everybody is just a little bit more cautious in how they approach the market this year.
I don't think you were having that 45-minute nap last year during the first day of free agency because, as you pointed out, there's a lot more action. And, it came to a point for me yesterday, Peter, waiting for the big news to come. Like, I was going back and forth with Daniel Jeremiah at NFL Network on the tie he was wearing and his wardrobe choice. I mean, there was a lull at this time where we were expecting big news to go on. But as far as what you mentioned with the Chargers, makes perfect sense and really like what they did when you consider positive year last year. It all starts with Justin Herbert, but they lose 3 out of 4 down the stretch. They give up mid-30s or in the 40s in all 3 of those losses. So they're coming out of the gate strong defensively, big names at D end and at corner. It's not a surprise, but if you're a Chargers fan, based off of what you saw last year, you love the start of their free agency.
Look, the way I look at what Brandon Staley did, and I want to relay a conversation that I had with him at the scouting combine. Essentially what Brandon Staley told me at the scouting combine was that they were going to be very, very active, in free agency this year, in part, because I think if you look at what the Chargers did, they almost recreated what Brandon Staley had in his 1 year with the Rams when they were the best defense in football. And so at the scouting combine, the way I usually use my time at the scouting combine is that, like this year, I put 30 lines in the water. I texted 30, 31 people in the 2 weeks before the scouting combine. And I just said, hey, here's when I'm going to be in Indianapolis do you have 20 minutes to spend with me at any point? And I have a little rubric that I set up and I just plug people in. So I plugged Brandon Staley in at 7:15 a.m. on Thursday in the lobby of his hotel. And so we met in the lobby of Le Méridien Hotel, formerly the Canterbury Hotel, basically right down the street from St. Elmo's. And I sat there, and we talked a lot about the way the season ended, why'd you go for it on 4th and 1 and all that. But the bigger thing that we discussed was kind of his plans going forward. And he basically said, my goal this year is to build a deep team. And you said it at the beginning, Paul. This was an average defense at best this year. And that really had to wound Brandon Staley. You could just tell that he wanted to address the defense. So, but he also wanted to make absolutely sure that they did everything to try to re-sign Mike Williams. The way he described Mike Williams was at the end of the year, after the last game against the Raiders, the heartbreaking loss to the Raiders, he said he was in the locker room and walked through, and there was Mike Williams. He said, of all the players on our team, he had 0 left in his tank. He was just, destroyed at the end of that game, mentally and physically. And he said, that is the kind of guy who I want for a long term going forward. So they re-sign him. They trade for Khalil Mack. And look, Brandon Staley broke into the NFL coaching linebackers for the Chicago Bears. And so he had a year with Khalil Mack in Chicago. And so I kind of look at Brandon Staley. He's got a jaundiced eye about Khalil Mack, who I said, hey, he's 31 years old now, coming off a foot injury. But he's convinced that he'll be the yin to, the yang of Joey Bosa on the other side, and we'll see. And then, obviously, getting the best corner in the draft in J.C. Jackson, and then getting an absolute space eater in the middle of his line for Sebastian Joseph Day for a very reasonable price, I think $8 million a year. I just think they addressed in the last week everything that they really needed to do with this team. How'd you see the Chargers?
Super interesting, Peter. And a couple of things really jump out now, kind of looking back at the last 24, 48 hours, what we've seen from them. Number one, I love the deal for Mack because it makes the best player on their defense, Joey Bosa, it makes him even better. When you throw in somebody on the other side, teams have to worry about. That's number one. It also made me think about the Rams. I mean, the Super Bowl winning team is always going to set some examples and direct some mindset at this time of year, no matter who it is. So you look at the Rams up front last year, they make that big deal for Von Miller, like Khalil Mack, not as good as he was at one point in his career, but as the second best pass rusher on the line, like Donald was the guy you had to worry about. Okay, we're going to bring in Von Miller. That was an awesome idea. So Khalil Mack, you can argue if he's the first or second best. I think he's the second most disruptive on that line. That's a pretty awesome thing to have on the other side of Bosa. And they probably would have made the deal anyway if Denver's quarterback situation was still Teddy Bridgewater and Drew Lock. But think about how much different it looks now in that division. 2 times they're going to have to play against Russell Wilson. And now they are much more equipped to do so. I'm not saying they're going to win those games, but those defensive moves for so many reasons, I think, look good and make a lot of sense with where they are in that division.
I just think that Brandon Staley saw the perfect defense, the well-balanced defense, which was, in 2020, the Rams were the number 1 defense in football. He was the defensive coordinator, and to him, Derwin James is the really powerful guy in the secondary that he felt he had with John Johnson. A lot of people don't really know or really understand how important John Johnson was in that defense with the Rams, but he was so integral to its success that year. He's the one who had the green dot on his helmet. He was the one who Brandon Staley was communicating with and was really the leader of especially the back end of that defense. But so really, he has that safety. He didn't have his Jalen Ramsey, okay, with the Chargers. And so now getting a really good peak performer cornerback, I think, is important. And look, I think edge rushers are always better when on those questionable, iffy downs, 3rd and 3, 2nd and 4. What are you going to do, run or pass? You need to have a space eater in the middle of that defense. It's why I believe this year in the draft, so many teams are enamored with the big guys in the middle of the line who are also athletic. And that's what Sebastian Joseph Day is. So look, the Chargers, they made a lot of noise, but I think it's all positive noise. Let's move to the contract that everyone has an opinion on. And I want to hear your opinion on the 4-year, I think $82 million contract, which in essence, in the guaranteed money, is 2 years and about $38 million for Christian Kirk, the wide receiver, who I really like. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But I had said in my column that I think this guy is a perfect fit for the New York Jets. Because when I was talking to people, hey, who's going to break the bank? Who's going to do this? Over the weekend, one very prominent agent said he thought the market for Christian Kirk would be very strong, but at about 13 to 15 million a year. Well, he in essence got 2 guaranteed years at about 19 million. And that, for a guy who's had one 100-yard game in his last 25 games, that's pretty heavy. I don't know. How did you see Kirk?
I'm going to back up a little bit to kind of get my point across here, Peter, but I'm from the Midwest. It's springtime, and we're always aware of tornadoes at this time of year back home. And the local news stations would come on with these sirens and these sounds for tornado watches. Didn't mean one was going to happen, but you need to be on the lookout for this thing that may happen. Take cover and get ready. And to me, when you think about overspending in the Jaguars, there was certainly a watch going on because they have two things that this time of year always lead to it, Peter. Number one, they have pretty good cap space. Number two, They have a quarterback they've invested a lot in, could go either way. If he's not a hit, the next 3 or 4 years of that franchise are completely in the tank. So they were certainly a candidate to do something like this. So 100% they overpaid to get him. But if he has 70 or 80 catches the next couple of years, if Trevor Lawrence takes a couple nice steps up the quarterback rankings, okay, it was worth it. But right now, absolutely an overspend and no surprise at all.
The reason I don't hate this is that even though Christian Kirk is not a particularly explosive receiver, his average per catch is in the mid 12s. I come out of this saying, I want a 25-year-old receiver with upside who's reliable, who's been fairly durable. And so I almost fall down on the side of, oh, man, that money is huge. But on the other side, this is going to be an important piece for Trevor Lawrence. I think that they're going to have a chance. I don't know if it's going to happen, but I think they're going to have a chance of building a receiving core. They also added Evan Engram. And look, Evan Engram is a fascinating player in this free agency. And because of his drop issues with the Giants, he probably had the worst hands of any tight end in football in his second and third years with the Giants. And I think that people look at him with very much a jaundiced eye. But, if you get him 1 year, $9 million, very much a prove-it contract, and understand that the way I see Evan Engram and the way I see Doug Peterson using Evan Engram is he will be basically a versatile slot receiver / tight end. And I don't mean he's going to be a slot receiver in the pure sense of the word, but I believe you will see Doug Peterson using him as a puzzle piece rather than an inline tight end exclusively, because I think they view him as having the ability in his second shot to be the kind of weapon that he never really got to be with the Giants. And look, from almost the start, people were just down on him because of his hands with the Giants. Fresh start is what he needs. I'm not saying he's going to be good, but I'm saying that I think he's got the prospect of being good, because remember, when he came out, he was a legit first-round tight end out of the SEC. And I just think, you know what happens, Paul, sometimes? You've seen this. You've played football at a very high level. I think there are some guys, and we're going to talk about one next in Mitchell Trubisky. Sometimes guys just get messed up, and it becomes a real challenge to let their talent flow when they're always having some self-doubts.
Totally agree. And before we move into Trubisky, one more thought on the Jags. They also signed Brandon Sheriff inside for, I think he's now the highest paid guard in the National Football League, somewhere around there. So it's just all a pattern right away. They have to prop up Trevor Lawrence. But Mitchell Trubisky, that signing, there are so many fun parts of this to discuss, Peter. What I like the most is that he's coming off a year where he finally got to sit with all the experience behind him and kind of get ready, exhale, and get ready for this next big opportunity that he's getting. Remember, he only had 1 year as a starter at North Carolina, and then he dives into all of it with the Bears. 50 starts. They win more games than they lose. They go to the playoffs multiple times. There are some good moments, but because he was drafted second, it was a conservative, boring offense. Ultimately, they didn't do well in January. He gets trashed. He gets to go sit behind an MVP caliber quarterback in Josh Allen, who, like him, runs very well. Who knows what he learned, how much he was able to grow as a quarterback by taking those 50 starts, learning from Brian Daboll, learning from Josh Allen. Okay, I'm a different guy now. I'm a more mature person. I'm a more mature quarterback. Let's put all this experience to use now at the next stop. And Pittsburgh didn't have to invest a lot to get that experience to roll the dice with him.
You know, what I think is so interesting about this, and I've been advocating for the Steelers to go after Jimmy Garoppolo.
Me too.
Who I still think was a better option than Mitchell Trubisky. But Mitchell Trubisky doesn't require compensation, and Jimmy Garoppolo would have required, at the very least, a second-round draft choice. I think the way I look at this is that by not playing last year, Mitchell Trubisky did more good to his career than he did in playing in Chicago. And that sounds crazy, but it's almost like sometimes you need to take a breath, get in a good situation, get mentally strong again. And I think I look at this as, the ironic thing is, Mitchell Trubisky grew up in Cleveland, in the Cleveland suburbs, big Browns fan, and now he's coming to resuscitate the quarterback fortunes of the Pittsburgh Steelers. And, if you think about it, Paul, aging is really kind of a funny thing, but, 14 years ago, when Mitchell Trubisky was near the end of his elementary school years in Cleveland, Ben Roethlisberger was getting drafted, and now Mitchell Trubisky is the one who's being asked to replace Ben Roethlisberger. Here's the one thing I would say which would be a positive about Trubisky for Steelers fans, okay? I was talking to somebody close to Brian Daboll recently. And I made this point. I said, man, it's so interesting to see Brian Daboll, and obviously if it's Daboll, it also has to be Joe Schoen, the new coach and GM, respectively, of the New York Giants. It's so interesting to hear that they have legitimate interest in bringing in Mitchell Trubisky to be the backup to Daniel Jones, but if he falters, to actually play. And I was told that both those guys could not have been more impressed last year with Trubisky, knowing that he had just been through the meat grinder of another failed quarterback in Chicago, which there's been a lot of them since Jim McMahon roamed the earth 34, 35 years ago. But not only that, but in practice, just watching him play the position, they thought, wow, this guy is really a talented player. Now, you know, Paul, you know this. There are some people who, on an empty practice field in Iowa City, can be, I'm sure you've had many teammates over the years who, man, this guy is doing great today. And then he gets in a game and he's not as good. And you look at that, and now I wonder, and I specifically wonder about the mental part of it with Trubisky. How do you like that choice of the Steelers? And what do you think going forward can be the future of Trubisky?
I like it a lot. And let's preface this, Peter, with this is the time of year to be overly positive. Glass is half full everywhere. Mitch Trubisky is not going to make a poor decision, lose a game, throw a pick for another 6 months on the negative side. This is the time to look at these moves and see the good. It would be easy to say, boy, NFC North, Lamar Jackson, Joe Burrow, your response is Mitch Trubisky. Okay, good luck with that. But to your point, and this is what I'm feeling with this too, and you mentioned Iowa City. Like coaches in practice would always say, there's only one quarterback out there playing. Everybody else stand back there and get mental reps. Mental reps only absorb so much and help you so much when you don't have the experience to put those mental reps on top of. So again, I go back to those 50 starts. Now you're not the starter. Your number one job is to be ready if you have to play and to get better. Watch somebody else who's better than you play the position. Listen to another coach's words as you watch that quarterback who's better than you. Like, I'm a real believer that is a pretty awesome thing that most quarterbacks don't get. He just got that season. So again, positive time of year, I can picture that and think, man, what a bonus for Mitch Trubisky to take that experience and learn in that situation. One other football thing I really like, and we can picture how ugly the Steelers offense was last year, Peter. Roethlisberger was just in the shotgun standing there. And Mitch Trubisky is not Josh Allen in terms of mobility, but they can get under center now. They can run play action boosts. That offense can look a whole lot different, not just because it's not Ben Roethlisberger, but because they have a quarterback who can allow them to expand that offense. They can call plays in a much different way. And one of the most subtle things of a balanced offense, Peter, let your quarterback get under center. So I'm excited for him, and I'm excited to see what the Steelers offense looks like with a quarterback who's not a Hall of Famer like the former guy was, but has a much different skill set.
Paul, this is, and I think it's a smart contract too.
Yes.
It maxes out at 2 years, $27 million, so that if Trubisky's really good, if he's really good this year, I'm sure they'll redo his contract to keep him beyond, 2024 or 2023, excuse me. But I just think, the prospect for Trubisky of having a chance with some good offensive weapons in an offense that wants the quarterback to be more mobile, obviously, than Roethlisberger was, I think this really has a chance to succeed. Let me move on to one thing that I really noticed in the first day. I teased it a little bit before, but I think teams are being a little bit more disciplined than they were. And by that, I mean that, so I'd say three very interesting quarterback contracts coming out very early on are, obviously J.C. Jackson, $18.5 million, I think, on average, with all the guaranteed money in the first 2 years. So what does that mean? Well, what it means is that you're paying a guy a lot of money for 2 years, but in year 3 and 4, you could say 3, 4, and 5. If you want to, you could say goodbye. And in a cap way, you're still going to have some money from the prorated signing bonus that remains. But essentially, you're not going to owe the guy any more money in that year. Your cap's going to be a little bit hit, but you're still going to have the cash to be able to deal with for the future. But then Carlton Davis, $15 million a year, and Charvarius Ward, who is kind of a sneaky little upset special with the 49ers for $14 million a year. But so what happens now? Stephon Gilmore, Darius Williams, Casey Hayward, all legitimate veteran cornerbacks. Darius Williams, basically the younger guy in that group. All of those guys, spent the first 24 hours of the market, wishing and hoping, but didn't get a deal done. And Paul, to me, what that says is that teams took a little bit of a smart pill before this and basically said, I'm sure there's a bunch of teams that would like to have Darius Williams. But the question is, now Darius Williams 1 year ago, if he had been on the market, would have been, to me, a $16 million corner. But right now, he wasn't as good in 2021 as he had been in 20. And right now, I think that people are hoping that it'll get in the sensible range, maybe $11 or $12 million a year, so that then they can go get guys who I'm sure they all think, can help them, but they just didn't want to overpay for.
You're thinking about sensible and smart, Peter. I know you kind of mentioned this a little bit, but I want to circle back because I think it's the main point of this conversation with the cornerbacks. I mean, J.C. Jackson and Carlton Davis are making really good money. But those were, and I'm kind of teeing you up here to put a tag on this, if you agree, those are more team-friendly deals than player-friendly deals, kind of setting the market for what's to come, right?
Oh, yeah, no question about it. And also, I think the other thing that you've seen, Paul, when it comes to team-friendly deals is that teams that have those quarterbacks that that they've got a year, maybe two left of light money spending, I think those are the teams you've seen go out and spend generously now. Like, I'm not sure, like Arizona spent $10.5 million a year on Zach Ertz, and they spent whatever it was, $8 or $10 million on James Conner. I mean, those are okay contracts, but honestly, what the Arizona Cardinals need to do, especially if they're going to have a light year in terms of the money they have to spend on their quarterback, which is still, we don't really know about that, their plans with Kyler Murray. In my opinion, they really have to sign Chandler Jones. You cannot rely on, you can't rely on J.J. Watt anymore. Whatever you get out of J.J. Watt's a bonus. And he might, who knows, he could play 17 games next year. He could also play 5. And so I think this is a team that is skating on a little bit of thin ice right now. But I think your point is right. Teams, I think, are being a little bit more conservative. And I think in some cases, teams are going to win this sort of battle. And by battle, I mean they're staring down guys like Darius Williams and saying, hey, if you can get $15 million a year, hey, all the power to you. We're willing to pay 12. If you're interested, come back and talk to us. So those are the kind of conversations, Paul, that happen on the first night of the tampering period and on the second day of the tampering period. What's happening is that agents for some of these really good players who are still out there are trying to play one bid against another. And I'm gonna use that as sort of a segue, as odd as it sounds, as a segue into one team that I really like in free agency. I'm going to ask you yours. But one team I like so far in free agency is a team that I think did not get played early on, and that is Cincinnati. So Cincinnati, everybody knew that, after Joe Burrow in 21 games last year got sacked 70 times, everybody knew that the Bengals had to put a lot of money into the offensive line. So, they looked at the landscape, and I think they got to a point with Ryan Jensen, the center for Tampa Bay, who before he re-signed with Tampa Bay, the Bengals were very interested. I think the New York Jets were highly interested. They might have gone past $14 million a year in trying to get Ryan Jensen. But at the end of the day, I think the Bengals put a legitimate price on players who they liked a lot, but weren't going to be, and I don't want, it's ridiculous to say held ransom for, but the Bengals basically made this calculation that Ted Karras at $6 million a year as a kind of a brawler, intelligent center who is not as good as Ryan Jensen, but who's going to cost less than half the amount of Ryan Jensen. Bring him in, and Alex Kappa, who is also a brawler type of guard, coming in from Tampa. So now the Bengals think they have upgraded at one guard, probably the left guard, and Karras, I would bet, is going to play center for him. And what they will do now is they will wait and see what happens in sort of low-cost free agency at tackle and at guard. And I still think no matter what they do, I still think what you're going to see is the Bengals hit the offensive line hard, high in this draft. So that's my team, Paul. Give me your team that you like what you've seen in the first 24 hours.
It's not a big splash start, but it's a nice start for the team that the Bengals got one of these offensive linemen from. I'm going to go to Tampa Bay, and the obvious one is Tom Brady, and that's just good fortune. It's nothing that they, they just kind of came to them that he wants to come back and play. But whether it's in 2 days or a week and a month, Peter, there will be at least one example, if not multiple examples, of players staying with them or wanting to go there to be a part of what he might be able to accomplish with them in the next couple of years. So to me, it all starts there. But I love what they're keeping. You mentioned Ryan Jensen. That's a big-time keep there as the center. I know that they lose offensive line next to him in the guards, and I don't want to say it's easy to replace a guard, but if you want to be needy one spot in the offense, I think guard is the one place where you're like, okay, I'll sign up for that. And I mentioned the name already of Carlton Davis, but not only do they keep him as their top corner, they keep him at a very good price. So I'd love to see them go out and get somebody. I know last year that they made news by keeping everybody. They're not going to keep everybody this year, but I like the start that they're off to a lot. A really good team last year that's kept a couple of good players at very good price.
I like that, Paul. Let's segue now into Tom Brady. Because I think what you just said, there's 2 points about Brady to be made. I mean, obviously, the simplest point is the one Jim Gray, his podcast partner and good friend, made to me Sunday night, an hour after this news broke. He said, Tom Brady does not want to be sitting on the couch next September watching the NFL and saying, man, what did I do? I'm as good or better than any of these guys, or as any of these guys. And so I think that was part of his reason, a good part. But I also think that, Tom Brady right now, it's less than 2 months after the season, right about 2 months after his season ended. And Tom Brady wakes up in the morning, and somebody else who knows Brady well told me this, that nothing hurts. Last year after the season, he needed some significant knee surgery. I went to Neil Elatrosh in L.A., who has become the sort of the heir to James Andrews as the guy who everybody wants to get their knee surgery from. But last year, he had to do significant rehab on a knee. This year, I'm told nothing hurts. His arm doesn't hurt. Nothing. And so you look at that and you start thinking about it, and you're Tom Brady. You just led the NFL in touchdown passes. You just led the NFL in passing yards. Do you realize that you're Tom Brady? It's been 14 years since he has done that. Remember his golden season with Randy Moss in 2007? He has not led the NFL, so widely since back in 2007. So he's sitting there saying, why shouldn't I play? But the key is he spent the last 6 weeks with his family, some in Florida where they live, some in New York where they have a second home, where they live a lot too, but also in Costa Rica where they go every off season, and then this past week in England. And I think he got the word, both spoken and unspoken. Tom, Dad, do what you want. Do what you think is best. And I think that is why he felt good about being able to say, I want to come back. And there's a very subtle sign, Paul. I don't know if you noticed this, but did you see the Gisele Bundchen social media thing where she said, something like, hey, we're back, go Bucks, ! I mean, if Gisele Bundchen is ticked off right now, within an hour of Brady saying he's coming back, do you think she'd be saying, woohoo, go Bucks? I mean, that really hit me. And I don't know what you saw of it, but I don't know. I'll leave the floor open for you on Brady.
Yeah, I was in the studio this weekend hosting Premier League, and we went to a break right before the Manchester United. We were previewing that match, Peter, and the producer got in my ear and said, we're hearing Tom Brady might be at the stadium, and we're efforting shots of him. But just so you know, if we come back and you see Tom Brady, just want you to be ready for it. And I'm thinking, okay, the Glazer family owns the Buccaneers. They own Manchester United. This all makes sense. And my next thought was, Peter, I'm like, I wonder if he's going to be on the pitch or if he's going to be in the stands. And it comes back and he's either in the box up in the stands or actually in the stands. So he's up there watching. And I remember thinking, and I had no thought that he was coming back at this point, Peter. I'm like, I wonder what this is going to do to him, to feel from the stands that kind of energy to watch this level of game. If he's going to think, God, I'm glad I'm not doing this anymore. Or is he going to think, I'm dying not to be the guy out there at the center of that attention. And then it's just, I don't know how much it had to do with his decision, Peter, but this superstar on that field, Cristiano Ronaldo, way in the back nine of his career, probably, if you just look at his age, had an unbelievable game. And it's not just a hat trick, but he had goals of all kinds that needed a wide range of terrific skill for that sport. It wasn't just kind of like he lucked into a couple goals. He was fantastic. As the whole picture came together, I wonder how much that had to do with his conviction that he was doing the right thing to watch somebody at that age have that kind of game and that kind of atmosphere. So I had no idea it was going to happen at that point, but I do remember thinking how he was affected by it.
My theory on that is that it may have confirmed or affirmed what Brady was already thinking, but he had to know on Saturday afternoon, sitting in a soccer stadium in England, he had to know by then that he was going to come back. And I'll tell you why. This is the second part of my story. So Ryan Jensen had started to hear, hold on. Don't make any hard and fast decisions. Here's the funny thing about this period in free agency. So everybody says, oh boy, you can start talking to teams and agents can start talking to teams on Monday of this week at noon Eastern time. Well, I mean, let's be honest. They start talking a long time before then, and they're all talking at the combine. So agents sit down with a head coach, having a beer at 11 o'clock at night, and these discussions are already being had. And so you kind of know what the market is going to be for players at that point. So Tom Brady reached out to Ryan Jensen, and I wrote this in my column, Sunday afternoon, and said, hey, I'm coming back. I want you. And we got to get this worked out. And as I wrote in my column, Mike McCartney, the agent who, I mean, if you look at Kirk Cousins over the last 6 years has made more money than any player in the NFL. And I think somebody wrote this weekend, and like he's 8 games over 500 in that time, without any championship games, without any Super Bowls, obviously. So Mike McCartney does a heck of a job. He knows how to create leverage. But now Mike McCartney had to go back to the Bucs Sunday afternoon knowing what was going on. And clearly, I think the Bucs knew on Sunday afternoon too. And so he had to go back and he had to tell them in essence, and this is how I divined the situation, okay? It might not be entirely true, but I think it's pretty close. Mike McCartney had to go back and say, okay, your quarterback's coming back. He wants, above all, Ryan Jensen and Rob Gronkowski. We all know that. Those are his 2 guys. He needs his center, especially with the fact that you're probably going to lose. You've already lost Ali Marpet, your Pro Bowl guard. He's retired. You're probably going to lose Alex Kappa. Somebody's going to pay him decent money. And, of course, the Bengals paid him 4 years, $40 million. But my point is, having said all of that Tom Brady, I think, was the rising tide that lifted all boats here. And he made Tampa Bay come up and bring its offer to Ryan Jensen up higher than they wanted to. And I think Jensen had this thought, I want 13. Mike McCartney had this thought, I want 13 a year. They finally got up to 13. 3 years, $39 million, and he was a buck. It was essential that Tom Brady decide by Sunday that he was going to come back. And if he was going to come back, then he would need for Ryan Jensen to come back. And look, we're all assuming that once the dust settles, Rob Gronkowski is going to come back for 1 more year. But they just have to figure out how in the world they're going to fit him into, what is already a ridiculously complicated salary cap structure. So I don't know, Paul. That's kind of how I see what happened with Brady at the end.
I think it's a good theory, Peter. And just one more thing to add on to the Brady situation. I think it will also help intangibly what they're doing with Chris Godwin, the wide receiver that Tom likes so much, and I think likes him back. Being franchised, nobody likes to be franchised. I think that will go in a better way with Brady on board now than it would have for someone who's extremely valuable to that offense.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. Paul, let's sort of end our day, our pod, with Deshaun Watson. And I think it's a multifaceted story, obviously. But I think with the fact that a Texas grand jury refused to indict him for sexual assault last Friday, that essentially opened the floodgates for teams to consider now Deshaun Watson. Reports it on Monday. He had Zoom meetings at least with Carolina and with New Orleans. He's probably going to have a similar Zoom meeting with Cleveland. I'm hearing that he may not have one with Seattle, that Seattle may not be as interested as people think, but who knows? We're early on in this process. I'm a little bit dubious of, okay, all the sex charges are behind him. Paul, there are some very, very angry women who feel wronged by Deshaun Watson, who feel that Deshaun Watson committed some sexual impropriety with them. There's 22 of these women. Jenny Varentis, not my old, she's still very young, colleague at Sports Illustrated, who now is with the New York Times, had a very interesting report last year for Sports Illustrated and in the past few days with the New York Times that the Houston Police Department detectives who looked into this case found at least 2 of the women who filed complaints to be very credible. And so my only point about all this is that for these teams that may go all in to to trade for Deshaun Watson, here's a scenario that I would say. Let's say they make a heavy trade and everything. I think aside from a very loud but probably small portion of fans, probably largely women, who are going to protest the signing, I think you risk over and over again in the coming months and maybe a couple of years that the women who have filed these civil suits against him, unless those suits are settled out of court and they basically are paid to go away, that those things could continue to come up. And you're asking your fan base to get behind the new leader of our team, Deshaun Watson. And look, he has been found guilty of nothing. He's been found liable for nothing. But there's an awful lot of smoke out there. And are you sure, if you're the Saints, you're the Panthers, you're the Browns, whatever other teams might want to get involved, are you sure that you want to cast your lot with a quarterback who there's going to be some ugly stuff in the next few months and perhaps years coming out? That is the guy you're going to choose to be the leader of your franchise. It's a little bit, I'm skeptical, quite honestly, and you're going to have to take a lot of guff in the court of public opinion if you sign Deshaun Watson.
I think, well, all at once, Peter, that we can all acknowledge that the biggest step to Deshaun Watson playing football again was taken with the criminal charges. I mean, that's not going to happen. But just because that allowed teams to really consider this and think about it doesn't mean that all those teams that are interested, for the reasons you pointed out, are going to actually make something happen. Because, we're going to hear some things. Today, I believe I believe he'll be speaking in court. We're going to learn some things and hear some things that maybe some teams will make them really reconsider. Some teams that are interested now. Neither one of us are saying that'll be the route that it goes, but I think we all need to be open to the idea that just because the criminal charges aren't going to be there doesn't mean that this is over. And really, for me, Peter, it's really, as I've walked through that door and thought about the next step here, it's really raised, more questions about anything. Number one, what is the league going to do? The NFL may step in after they learn whatever they're going to learn. There may be a couple game suspension. There may be an 8-game suspension. There may not be any suspension, but teams are going to have to know that before they're willing to give up a first-round pick or maybe even 3 first-round picks. So that's, and the no trade clause. What kind of leverage does that leave Houston with? And the fact that they're not going to have him around for that kind of cap hit. There are so many interesting things that are unknowns that, as much as we want to compare it just deal-wise to what just happened with Russell Wilson in Denver and Seattle, in another way, this has nothing to do with that. And that precedent won't have anything to do with what eventually happens with Deshaun Watson. So big hurdle cleared, I guess, with the criminal charges. But to me as many questions moving forward as I had before, even though they're of a different variety.
I think all of that, Paul, is true. I would just say that, you know, Ben Roethlisberger got a 6-game suspension for his alleged sexual impropriety. Never was formally charged with a crime. There were just accusations. And I think that Roger Goodell, with the multiple, cases against Deshaun Watson, he'll definitely get some sort of ban. I don't know how much it'll be, but be that as it may, I think the interesting thing to watch going forward is, how many teams, in essence, will be scared away by this. And I think several of them have been scared away by it. And we'll see what happens going forward.
Hi, I'm Mike Tirico, and thanks for watching. Make sure to hit subscribe for the latest news and highlights from NBC Sports.